Hello and welcome. I'll probably follow the same form and say a few words of introduction about me, which you may or may not find helpful. The first thing to say is I woke up the other day and realised I've been in the public service or in the civil service for very nearly 30 years, which I suppose makes me the very definition of a career civil servant. But please don't use that as an accusation. I'm quite proud of 30 years of public service. And I've had a very interesting time, and I've worked on very many interesting aspects of policy and government delivery, from economic policy to tax. I worked in the Treasury for many years. I've been through quite a lot of Chancellor's budgets. I've worked in a couple of operational agencies and delivered some services on the ground, and I've worked with a whole range of professionals both inside the civil service and outside in industry and beyond, and it's been a fascinating career so far. I've also been through quite a lot of spending reviews, budgets, as I've said, about 8 general elections, I think, now, and many, many ministers. And one of the frustrations of working in any subject in Whitehall is just when you think you've got a working relationship with a minister and you're making progress with their policy objectives, they tend to get moved on. And such is life. So in that respect, I've had quite an interesting 12 months as well. Having said that, you may just detect that despite 30 years working in Whitehall, my accent isn't from the south. I was born in Salford, and I needed no excuse to come back up north again to be here today. So thank you for the invitation. What is it that we do down in Whitehall? I've got 2 young daughters, the youngest of which often asks me that question. She has several times as she's been growing up, and I'm not entirely convinced I've found an answer yet that satisfies myself, let alone her, but I'll have a quick go here. My current role is the main departmental sponsor for the NDA. I also deal with 1 or 2 other organisations, which I'll touch on as well. And what does that mean? Well, as the main sponsor, our job is to exercise scrutiny on what the NDA does. It's a very, very large business. It's a very, very significant part of government expenditure. And as you will well know, it's one of the most difficult and complex briefs in the whole of the public sector. So our job is to keep a close eye on the NDA, to work with them, to work constructively with them, I hope, and to provide scrutiny and, where necessary, challenge. And as Tom said, it's been a difficult and challenging year this year, and I've been involved in most, if not all, of the subjects that he's talked about today. I mentioned spending reviews because one of the first things I did when I moved on to a nuclear brief about 7 years ago was I was thrown in at the deep end, and I was asked to lead the negotiations with the Treasury on behalf of the department and ultimately on behalf of the NDA on their spending review settlement. And that was at a time, obviously, of very, very significant austerity, where the pressure was to reduce spending wherever possible. And the challenge of fighting the NDA's corner, if you like, on what was a £3 billion a year spending envelope, £12 billion in total, I think, over the 4 years, was very difficult and very challenging. But I still recall some of the aspects of that, and it's very satisfying to see that some of the things which at that time were simply lines in a spreadsheet of a bid that we were putting forward survived both the spending review discussions but also came to fruition. And I see some of them here today, and one that caught my eye outside was the archive, which I think it's fair to say started life as a line on a spreadsheet some years ago during those discussions. My team also has a wider role. We are the main interface and support for an independent committee, Committee on Radioactive Waste Management, Quorum. And I have to apologise because I would have loved to have been here for the whole of this event and particularly for the second day, but I need to go back later today because I've got a meeting with Quorum tomorrow back in London. And we also coordinate the department's engagement with the NGO Forum, which brings together a wide variety of interested stakeholders, and dare I say, not the biggest fans of either nuclear or the NDA or the department in general. But I'm really pleased to see that Professor Andy Blowers is here today and is speaking later on. I attended the last NGO forum a week ago, and it was a fascinating discussion. And it's really important that we keep that kind of open dialogue going with all parties who've got views on these subjects. And very finally, we also do some quite, dare I say, mechanical stuff. We deal with all the advice to ministers, we deal with all the PQs on subject areas, we deal with all the correspondence, and we offer suggestions for how ministers might answer all of those. So to any of the one or two MPs in the audience, I think the former MP as well, the next time you pick up your pen and decide to ask the Secretary of State a challenging question, think of us, because we're the poor buggers who have to answer it. Now, I wanted to talk about three things, all of which are in my job title, which is a relatively recent job title. It says I'm Deputy Director of Strategy, Engagement and Innovation, and I'm hoping that we try and add value in all three of those areas. On strategy, I really wanted to highlight three current areas of challenge for the nuclear sector, for the nuclear industry, and for the communities and people involved in the sector. But also three possible opportunities as well. One of the current issues, as you will well know, is cost. Cost has always been important to government. Cost has been particularly important since 2007, 2008. And there is a perception around the nuclear industry, both on tackling the legacy and on nuclear new build, that costs only ever go in one direction, whether it's the estimate of the cost of Hinkley C or whether it's the estimate of the cost of the nuclear provision. There's also a more subtle and I think nuanced concept in government around intergenerational transfer, which I think many of you will be familiar with, the idea that current and future generations are effectively paying for some of the costs of the cheap electricity that was enjoyed by their parents and their grandparents without full regard to cleaning up the remaining legacy. And also, that's also a live debate now with people looking at the price paid for the electricity for Hinkley C. Have we saddled future generations with costs that we shouldn't have done so? I'll come back to the opportunity around this. The second challenge are the alternatives to nuclear, particularly the alternatives to generating electricity, to baseload in the form of renewables. Incidentally, the costs of which we know are coming down. There's been a lot of recent publicity on offshore wind around prices for electricity there. And there is a debate about whether or not we actually need nuclear. You know, will these renewable technologies come and provide alternatives, and can we cope, if they do so, with their intermittency, etc., through storage, whether it's carbon capture and storage or whether it's battery storage. So that's the second big challenge. And the third big challenge, and a word I hesitate to use sometimes in this sort of company, but is a word that is bandied around government, is incumbency. Now, incumbency takes many forms and means different things to different people, but it's often used to describe the nuclear industry because it's the same old players, the same government organisations consuming large amounts of taxpayers' money. It's very insular sometimes, is the accusation, and it only talks to itself. So I think it's really, really important that we're here at an event where actually we're having a much wider dialogue. It's very much about engagement, and it's very much, I think, in keeping with the wider efforts of government now to have a much wider debate here and to transcend any accusations of incumbency. So on to some opportunities. It's not all doom and gloom, by the way. Some opportunities, and many of these are my personal views rather than necessarily policy views from the centre of government. But one policy view is that government's very clear that we do need baseload electricity. We're going to need power generation for some time to come, and we absolutely need the right energy mix. And at the moment, nuclear provides a very significant amount of that, and the likelihood is it's going to be somewhere in the mix going forward. So the government has a very clear and positive attitude, and it's going to be increasingly the case because we're also increasingly announcing specific steps to decarbonise industry, to decarbonise heat, and recently to decarbonise transport. So all of those things will simply add to the demands for secure and clean baseload electricity. The second aspect of that is in the transition, and I think this is where nuclear has a role to play as well. We know the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine, and intermittency and balance in the mix of energy is an important aspect here. And I think, again, nuclear and nuclear technology, and particularly some of the newer technologies, which I'll talk about again in a minute, potentially small modular reactors, I think will have a role to play there. And finally, a sort of general challenge, I think, to everybody in the room, which is whatever your point of view and whatever your role is, you are part of this sector, you are part of this industry, you are part of the communities and the workforce that support it. And I think now, more than ever, is the time to find a voice, to have a balanced and informed debate about the benefits and the costs, the good and the bad aspects of what nuclear can bring to the UK, whether it's on power generation or security of supply, wider economic benefits, regional policy, developing facilities like the one we're in today. There's a big debate to be had there, and I think sometimes nuclear lacks a single voice, and I think sometimes people feel it's best to keep their heads down. I would argue now's the right time to put your heads collectively and individually above the parapet and make the case and have the debate. And again, let's start the engagement now. So how can we rise to some of these challenges and opportunities? Again, I wanted to try and rather selfishly link them back to my role. I wanted to talk about the other two parts of my job, which are engagement and innovation. And on engagement, again, I want to issue some of the themes of this conference. I think if I'm going to be properly able to do my job, and my team are going to be able to properly advise ministers and inform them about the issues that they're going to have to take very important decisions on. And if we're to inform Parliament so it can debate those decisions, and the wider public so it can understand why its representatives have made those decisions, I think we must, between us, make sure that firstly we gather the right evidence, we gather the right data, we analyse it properly in a robust way, and where necessary we challenge it. To do that, I think we must be prepared to listen to as wide a variety of views and opinions, and if necessary, conflicting data as possible. A good example was last week during the NGO forum, where we had competing scientific data around the risks involving nuclear. And we should be open to that and listen to a range of views. And most of all, and again a personal view, we must be prepared to get out, both physically and metaphorically, from Whitehall and from the Whitehall village. Not just to sit there thinking about policy in the narrow sense and the politics and the mechanics of government, but more widely to think about the issues that affect this sector and the wider issues I've touched on, and crucially, to be open to ideas from the outside. And that in particular, I think, being open to ideas from the outside to transcend the not invented here syndrome, I think that's one of the main tools for tackling the issue of incumbency. And again, I'm pleased to be out of London here today. And innovation is the final element of my role. Now, this is an area where I think nuclear technology, the science around it, the R&D, the practical application, the engineering, all of these things have something to bring to the challenges and to the opportunities. Now, I know David's going to talk about progress on decommissioning, particularly on specific sites, so I'm not going to touch on that, but there's many examples of innovation now in moving that programme forward. But I wanted to touch very briefly on one area that I've also got responsibility for, which is looking into the issue of smaller reactors, new generations of technology for reactors, SMRs as they're sometimes called, small modular reactors or advanced modular reactors. And I think there's three areas of innovation here, all of which we're looking at the moment. The first is the technology. What does the new technology look like? How does it differ from what we've got at the moment? What extra advantages does it bring in terms of safety, cost efficiency, etc.? The second, and a really important one for the supply chain and for the wider industry, what benefits can modular construction and modern methodologies bring? And I was very lucky a little while ago to be invited to the opening of the camel-led modular construction facility, which I think is exactly the sort of tangible example of how we can help move this debate forward and position the UK to take best advantage of some of these new types of innovation in construction. And then finally, and by no means least importantly, in financing. Financing and the sort of commercial arrangements around how we do very large infrastructure projects. Because let's face it, anything on the nuclear side, whether it's a new reactor, a new power station, or whether it's one of the major programs for the NDA, it's always going to fall into the large infrastructure project category. And clearly the way in which we've tackled these projects in the past has made them difficult to consume in terms of people's balance sheets and in terms of the financing and the commercial aspects. And we need to look again at that. And perhaps, again, smaller deployment of reactor technology might be one way of making it more consumable, but breakthroughs in innovation in the way in which we try and finance these things, I think is an area that we should be looking at. And I think there is a role for communities in all of this. You know, my challenge would be you need to be prepared to be the first to adopt new technology. You know, subject to all the safeguards, all the regulatory approvals, you need to be the first to say, yes, we are comfortable with new designs of nuclear generation, or we are comfortable that the right risks are being taken in order to clean up the legacy, in order then to make progress and reverse that intergenerational transfer issue that I talked about before. So I think I've come to the end of my time, probably. No one's signalled at me yet, but I'm sure I've waffled on for too long. So those are a few thoughts from the centre. Happy to answer more questions, happy to talk in a bit more detail about what we do, and happy to make some more contacts here today. So come and grab me while I'm here over lunch, but otherwise, if I don't see you, have a good conference. Thank you very much.